Alright, locate your notes, completing the square. Completing the square is a process that you use when you cannot factor a quadratic. Sort of like the quadratic formula. It's just a different method for solving a quadratic. So that means we need to know what a perfect square trinomial is. So if you square a factor, so we're going to square x minus 4. That means x minus 4 times x minus 4. We FOIL this out, we're going to get x squared minus 8x plus 16. So a perfect square trinomial is when you have the same factor twice. So for example, like x plus 5 squared. We're going to get x squared plus 10x plus 25. Or x minus 3 squared. You're going to get x squared minus 6x plus 9. Alright, so if we're solving a quadratic equation that's not in the form like above, then we'll make it into a perfect square trinomial. That's what we mean by completing the square. We're going to be finding this number, our c, to make our quadratic a perfect square trinomial. We first have to figure out what is the pattern for finding c in a standard quadratic equation. So if we want to look at the relationship between b and c in all of these. Well, you might notice that c can be found by taking half of b and squaring it. So that's how we're going to complete the square. Now we can only do this if our lead coefficient is 1, our a is 1. So to find c, we're going to take half of b and square it. So let's just practice that first. Let's find c. So if b is 10 here, we're going to take half of b and square it. So 5 squared is 25. So now it's going to give us a perfect square trinomial, and we're asking ourselves what multiplies to give us 25 but adds to give us 10. So we're going to have x plus 5 squared. Notice this factor, that 5, is half of b. That's going to work for us each time. Alright, let's find c for the second one. We have x squared minus 12x plus c. So we're going to take half of b and square it. So negative 6 squared is 36. And then we're going to factor it. What multiplies to give you 36 but adds to give you negative 12. So negative 6 and negative 6. So when it factors, we're going to end up with x minus 6 squared. That's our goal, to get this. Alright, number 3. We can't do this. We can't take half of b until their a is 1. So we're going to factor out that 2 first. And now we're going to find c. So now we got to go half of b squared. So negative 4 squared, which is 16. Alright, so when we factor this one, we've got that 2 out front. And then what multiplies to give you 16, but adds to give you negative 8, it's going to be x minus 4, x minus 4. So that's why we get our x minus 4 squared. Alright, so let's see how we're going to use this to solve a quadratic. Look at the following. Now we've got to remember one important rule. We've got to keep our equation balanced. So whatever we add to the right side, we're going to have to add to the left side also to keep our equation balanced. So we have the following question. X squared minus 12x plus 4, and we're asked to solve. Well, the first thing you should try to do is see if this factors. But there's nothing that multiplies to give you 4 and adds to give you negative 12. So that's why this is good for completing the square. So the first step, these are the steps. So it's an algorithm. You have to learn these steps. We're going to isolate the x squared and the x term. So x squared minus 12 plus something, leave yourself some space, is equal to negative 4 plus something. Remember, we're going to have to keep this equation balanced. This is where we find the c. So our c is going to be half of b squared, which is negative 6 squared, which is 36. So that's what we're going to add to both sides of our equation. We must keep this thing balanced. Now we're going to factor. What multiplies to give us 36 but adds to give us negative 12? Well, it's this negative 6. So x minus 6 times x minus 6, so that's where we get x minus 6 squared. This factor is always going to be half of b. And then negative 4 plus 36 is 32. Well, this should look like what we just got finished doing, solving by using isolating using square roots. We've turned it into one of those questions. So now we're going to square root both sides. So x minus 6 equals plus or minus the square root of 32. All right, and then we're just going to add 6 plus or minus the square root of 32. But we need to simplify 32. 32 is 16 times 2. So this is going to simplify to 6 plus or minus 4 square root of 2 is your final answer. So my two answers are 6 minus 4 square root of 2 and 6 plus 4 square root of 2. Now we could enter this in the calculator into y equals and find our zeros to check our answers. But we would get decimal answers. Unfortunately, our calculator won't give it to us in this form. Alright, it's just about practicing that process. So let's practice some more. Notice this one has a lead coefficient of 2. So that means just like we did in our previous example, we're going to have to factor out that 2. But I don't want to divide everything by 2 because 15 is not divisible by 2. So I'm going to start by isolating. So I'm going to add the 15. Alright. I'm going to factor out the 2. So I get x squared plus 4x plus I'm going to find my c. Now be careful here. Because we factored out that 2, when I add it to the other side, I have to include that 2 to keep this thing balanced. Alright, let's find c. It's half of b squared. So 2 squared is 4. So I'm going to add 4, and then on the other side it's going to be 2 times 4. Alright, so let's factor. What multiplies to give me 4 but adds to give me 4? Well, that's 2 and 2. So that's when it end up with x plus 2 squared. Alright, and then we get what? Negative 15 plus 8, which gives me what? Negative 7. Alright, so here, before I can square root, I need to divide by 2. So I end up with x plus 2 squared equals to negative 7 halves. Now I get to square root both sides. So I get x plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 7 over the square root of 2. Well, I've got some cleaning up to do. Let's move the 2 over. Plus or minus square root of 7. We're going to pull the I out, and then we over the square root of 2. Well, remember we don't want to leave the square root of 2 in the denominator, so we do need to rationalize. So our final answer, right over here so I have some room, is negative 2 plus or minus square root of 7 times the square root of 2 is square root of 14 over 2i. So if you were to graph this, this would not touch the x-axis. That lets you know that you have an imaginary solution. But be careful, if the lead coefficient is some number other than 1, you're going to have to factor that out. Alright, we're just going to practice using this process. It's all about learning the process. Alright, solve by completing the square. So we're going to isolate first. I always leave myself some room to find my c and remind myself that I have to add it to both sides. So c is going to equal to half of b squared. So that's 10 squared, which is 100. So we're going to add 100 to both sides. Alright, factor. What multiplies to give you 100 but adds to give you 20? It should be half of b, which is 10. So it's going to be x plus 10 squared. Negative 19 plus 100 is 81. Square root both sides. plus or minus the square root of 81 is 9. Well, I can simplify this. I can move my 10 over, and then I've got to find my two equations. So I need to break these apart. I've got x equals negative 10 minus 9, and x equals negative 10 plus 9. So my two solutions are negative 19 and negative 1. So because these are integers, that means that this thing would have factored. But you see that I get the same answer by completing the square. All right, let's look at this one. What do I notice first? Well, I notice that they're all divisible by 3. So I'm going to do that first. It makes my number smaller to work with. And because this is an equation, I don't need to keep that GCF. So I'm going to end up with x squared minus 12x plus 50. All right, I'm going to isolate. So I'm going to add something, negative 50 plus something. All right, find C. Half of b squared. So negative 6 squared is 36. So we're adding 36 to both sides. Factor. What multiplies to give you 36 but adds to give you negative 12? It's negative 6 and negative 6. So x minus 6 squared is equal to negative, what's 50 minus 36? It's 4, negative 14. Square root both sides, plus or minus the square root of negative 14. So x is equal to, is add the 6, plus or minus, pull the negative out, which makes it I. So I get plus or minus the square root of 14, and then i's on the outside. So my two solutions are 6 minus the square root of 14i, and 6 plus the square root of 14i. All right. I notice I have a negative 2 up front. Not everything's divisible by negative 2, but I want to keep that lead coefficient positive, so I'm going to divide everybody by negative 1. Just makes my work a little bit easier instead of have to carry around that negative. So this becomes 2x squared minus 4x plus 5 equals to 0. All right, let's isolate. Since I have a lead coefficient, I have to factor that out before I find C. And don't forget, because I have that, I'm going to have to multiply it on the other side. All right, C. It's always half of b squared. So negative 1 squared is 1. So I'm adding 1, and this is going to be 2 times 1. Keep the 2. I have to factor what multiplies to give you 1 but adds to give you negative 2. It's going to be negative 1 squared. X minus negative 1 squared. And here I get negative 5 plus 2, which is negative 3. Divide by 2. I'm going to get negative 3 halves. Square root both sides. I'm going to get plus or minus the square root of 3 over the square root of 2, and I pulled my I out of that square root of, negative square root of 3. All right, then we got to rationalize, and we're almost done. Move the 1, plus or minus square root of 3 times the square root of 2 is 6, square root of 6 over 2i. So those are my two solutions. All right. We're also going to use completing the square to put an equation that's in standard form into vertex form. Remember, vertex form looks like this. So we can use completing the square to do this process. And this actually, completing the square, is something you're going to use in pre-calc or in advanced functions next year with our conics unit. So you have to be really good with completing the square to go on to the higher level math course. All right, so we're going to do kind of the same thing. We're going to isolate, but I'm just going to move that 22 to go with my y this time. I'm not going to set it equal to 0. So I'm going to go y minus 22 plus something equals to x squared minus 10x plus my something. So I'm still going to isolate my two terms. I'm going to find c, which is half of b squared. So negative 5 squared, 25. So I'm going to add 25 to both sides. All right, let's simplify that. Negative 22 plus 25 is positive 3. Let's factor. What multiplies to give you 25 but adds to give you negative 10? What's going to be negative 5 and negative 5? So that's going to factor to x minus 5 squared. Well, remember, my goal is to get it to look like this. So all I simply need to do is move the 3. And now it's in vertex form. And so my vertex is 5, negative 3. Like I said, you're going to use this process with conics next year. Let's practice one more. All right, here I've got a negative 2 lead coefficient. All right, I'm not going to divide by negative 1 this time because it's not set equal to 0, so that ends up making more work for me. So I'm still going to isolate. I'm going to move the 1, set myself up. Because I have that lead coefficient, I'm going to go ahead and factor out that negative 2, which makes it x squared plus 2x plus my something. So since I factored in a negative 2, I've got to remember to multiply it on the other side. All right, so let's see, we got to find c. So half of b squared, so 1 squared is 1. So I'm going to add 1 and then negative 2 times 1. All right, what do I get? Minus 1 minus 2 equals negative 2. Factor what multiplies to give you 1 but adds to give you 1. So it's 1 and 1. So that's going to factor to x plus 1 squared. Add my numbers. Almost in vertex form. All I need to do is move the 3. So my vertex this time is negative 1, 3. All right, we're going to continue and show you a couple of pre-calc level questions. Okay, so kind of starting to say what's your goal for next year. So these are pre-calc level questions. I'm going to use the same process, but notice that here my b is not divisible by 2. So I'm going to have to work with fractions. All right, same process. I isolate it, and then I found c is half of b squared, but I ended up with a fraction. So I'm adding 25/4 to both sides. All right, I factored. Now here's where you really need to realize that this is the half of b gives you your factor. So when I factor x squared plus 5x plus 25/4, I'm going to get x plus 5/2 squared. And then negative 2 plus 25/4 is 17/4. We square root both sides, not remembering our plus or minus, and then we subtract the 5/2. So we're just going to practice a couple with fractions where a b is not even. So here I'm going to move the 4 plus something is equal to 4 plus my c. Find c, so it's half of b squared. So that's going to give me 9/4. So I'm adding 9/4 to both sides. So when I factor what multiplies to give you 9/4 and adds to give you negative 3, it's going to be that negative 3/2. So x minus 3/2 squared. That's always half of b. All right, and if I add this, I'm going to get, 16/4 plus 9/4. So x minus 3/2 squared equals to 25/4. Square root both sides. So I get plus or minus the square root of 25 over the square root of 4. So x is equal to 3/2 plus or minus 5/2. Well, I can simplify this more. Break it into 2. 3/2 minus 5/2 and 3/2 plus 5/2. So my two answers are negative 2/2, which is negative 1, and then 8 over 2, which is 4. So this would have actually factored if we had realized that. All right, let's try one more. All right, here I've got a Lie coefficient. So I'm going to isolate first. Factor out my 2. Don't forget, because I factored out a 2, I'm going to have to multiply on the other side. Find C. It's half of B squared, which is 1/4. So we've got 1/4 on each side now. Keep my 2, or factor. All right, this is going to be my half of B, so it's going to be minus 1/2 squared. So I got negative 5, 2 times 1/4 is 2/4, which is 1/2. All right, so 2x minus 1/2 squared. All right, let's add these fractions. What do I get? Negative 10 plus 1 over 2. So I get 2x minus 1/2 squared equals negative 9/2. Multiply both sides by a half. So I get x minus 1/2 squared equals to 9/4. Square root both sides. X minus 1/2 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 9 over the square root of 4. So x is equal to, move the 1/2, plus or minus, the square root of negative 9 is 3i, and the square root of 4 is 2. All right, I can't combine my like term. I got complex answers. So 1/2 minus 3/2 I, and 1/2 plus 3/2 I. All right, so we same process with the fractions, so don't let the fractions scare you. All right, let me know if you have any questions.